Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, students, this is lecture number 12 on postmodern fiction. The topic of today's discussion is beloved. Students, in today's discussion, we are going to discuss the themes, motives, and symbols of beloved. In our previous lecture, we have discussed about the characters of the novel. Students, in today's lecture we are going to discuss slavery's destruction of identity, the importance of community solidarity, the powers and limits of language, family, in motives, the supernatural things, allusions to Christianity, in symbols, the color red, trees, the tin tobacco box. Students, Beloved explores the physical, emotional, and spiritual devastation wrought by slavery, devastation that continues to haunt those characters who are former slaves even in freedom. The most dangerous of slavery's effects is its negative impact on the former slaves' senses of self, and the novel contains multiple examples of self-alienation. Students, Paul D, for instance, is so alienated from himself that at one point he cannot tell whether the screaming he hears is his own or someone else's. Slaves were told that they were subhuman and were traded as commodities whose worth could be expressed in dollars. Consequently, Paul D is very insecure about whether or not he could possibly be a real man, and he frequently wonders about his value as a person. Students, Seth also was treated as a subhuman. He once walked in on school teacher giving his pupils a lesson on her animal characteristics. She too seems to be alienated from herself and filled with self-loathing. Thus she sees the best part of herself as her children. Yet her children also have volatile, unstable identities. Delvaux conflates her identity with Beloved's, and Beloved feels herself actually beginning to physical disintegrate. Students, slavery has also limited baby Sug's self-conception by shattering her family and denying her the opportunity to be a true wife, sister, daughter, or loving mother. So students, as a result of their inability to dream, slavery has also limited baby Sug's self-conception by shattering family and denying her the opportunity to be a true wife, sister, daughter, or loving mother. As a result of their identity to believe in their own existence, both baby Suggs and Paul D become depressed and tired. Students, baby Suggs' fatigue is spiritual, while Paul D's is emotional. While a slave, Paul D developed self-defeating coping strategies to protect him from the emotional pain he was forced to endure. Any feelings he had were locked away in the rusted tin of his heart, and he concluded that one should have nothing to intentionally. Students, other slaves, Jackson, Till, Aunt, Pilas, and Harley went insane, and thus suffered complete loss of self. Student Satya fears that she too will end her days in madness. Indeed, he does prove to be mad when he kills her own daughter. Yet Satya's act of infanticide eliminates the perverse forces of the institutions of slavery. Under slavery, a mother best expresses her love for her children by murdering them and thus protecting them from the more gradual destruction wrought by slavery. Student Stampede uses that slavery's negative consequences are not limited to the slaves. He notes that slavery causes whites to become changed and altered, made bloody, silly, worse than they ever wanted to be. The insidious effects of the institution affect not only the identity of its black victims, but those of the whites who perpetrate it and the collective identity of Americans. Students, where slavery exists, everyone suffers a loss of humanity and compassion. For this reason, Morrison suggests that our nation's identity, like the nation's, like the novel's characters, must be healed. Students, America's future depends on its understanding of the past, just as Satya must come to terms with her past before she can secure a future with Denver and Paul D. Before we can address slavery's legacy in the contemporary problems of racial discrimination and discord, we must confront the dark and hidden corners of our history. Crucially, students, in Beloved we learn about the history and legacy of slavery not from school teachers or even from Baldwin's point of view, but rather from Seth's, all these stampedes and babysiters. Students, Morrison writes history with the voices of people historically denied the power of language, and Beloved recuperates, explicates a history that had been lost either due to guilt, forgetfulness, and incest oppression of her memories, or to forced silence, as in the case of all these island victims. Students, Beloved demonstrates the extent to which individuals need the support of their communities in order to survive. Seth first begins to develop a sense of self during her 28 days of freedom, when she becomes a part of Cincinnati community. Similarly, Denver discovers herself and grows up when she leaves 1 to 4 and becomes a part of society. Baldy and his fellow prison inmates in Georgia prove able to escape only by working together. They are literally changed to one another, and Baldy recalls that if one lost, all lost. Mostly, it is the community that saves Seth from mistakenly killing Mr. Baldwin and casting the shadow of another sin across her and her family's life. Students, Cincinnati's black community plays a pivotal role in the events of 1 to 4. The community's failure to alert Seth to schoolmaster's approach implicates it in the death of Seth's daughters. Baby Seth feels he slights as a grave betrayal from which he never fully recovers. Students, at the end of the novel, the black community make up for its past misbehavior by gathering at 1 to 4 to collectively exorcise Beloved. By deriving Beloved away, the community secures Seth's and its own release from the past. Students, when 6 return school teachers reasoning around to justify having broken the rules, the school teachers with him demonstrated that definitions belong to the definers, not to the defined. The slaves eventually come to realize the illegitimacy of many of the white definitions. Mr. Gardner, for example, claims to have allowed his slaves to live as real men, but all the questions just how manly they actually are. So too does Paul D. finally come to realize with bitter irony the fallacy of the name Sweet Home, although Six eventually reacts to the hypocrisy of the historic of slavery by abandoning English altogether. Other characters use English to define the world on their own terms. They research and Stampede, for example, rename themselves. Beloved may be read as Morrison's effort to transform those who have always been defined into definers. Students, white slaves, the characters manipulate language and transcend its standard limits. Their command of language allows them to adjust its meaning and to make themselves indecipherable to the white slave owners who watch them. For example, Paul D. in Georgia prison inmates sing together about their dreams and memories by gobbling and tricking the words. Students, the title of the novel alludes to what is ultimately the product of a linguistic misunderstanding. At her daughter's funeral, Sutton interpreted the minister's address to the dearly beloved as referring to the dead rather than living. All literature is indebted to this slippery, shifting quality of language, the power of metaphor, simile, autonomy, irony, and wordplay all result from the ability of words to attach and detach themselves from various possible meanings. Students' Beloved explores how the conditions of slavery at once make family more fragile and more firmly bonded. Since slaves were considered private property, slave owners could speak up, could break up families by buying or selling individual family members. Students, it was especially lucrative to sell children who were young and had many working years left. Maybe Searles directly experienced having her children sold to other slave owners. She gave birth to 9 children, all but one of whom were taken from her, yet the experience of losing nearly all of her children did not break baby Searles. On the contrary, it greatly intensified her relationship with her one remaining son, Harley, who went to extraordinary lengths to buy her freedom. The familial bonds produced by slavery can also prove dangerous, as demonstrated by the intensity of Sethe's maternal instincts. Students, when school teacher arrives at 1 to 4, Sethe does not hesitate in her attempt to protect her children from him, but others find it deeply disturbing that Sethe attempted to protect her children by trying to kill them. Paul D, for instance, tells Sethe that her maternal love is too thick, but Sethe rejects his claim and insists love is or it ain't. Thin love and no love at all. Students, Morrison enhances the world of Beloved by investing it with supernatural dimensions. While it is possible to interpret the book's paranormal phenomena within a realist framework, many events in the novel, most notably the presence of a ghost, push the limits of ordinary understanding. Moreover, the Detractors in Beloved do not hesitate to believe in the supernatural status of these events. For them, premonitions and hallucinations are ways of understanding the significance of the world around them. Such occurrences stand in marked contrast to school teachers' perverse, hyper-scientific and empirical studies. Students, Lover's epigraph taken from Romans 9:25 bespeaks the presence that Christian ideas will have in the novel The Four Horsemen Who Come for Seth reference the description of Apocalypse found in the book of Revelations. Beloved is reborn into Seth's world, drenched in a sort of baptismal water. At an infant, Daniel drinks her children, her sister's blood, along with her mother's breast milk, which can be interpreted as an act of communion that links Daniel and Beloved, and that highlights the sacrificial aspect of the baby's death. Students, Seth's act so horrifies school teacher that he leaves without taking her other children, allowing them to live in freedom. The baby's sacrificial death, like that of Christ, brings salvation. The book's larger discussion of sin, sacrifice, redemption, forgiveness, love, and resurrection similarly resound with biblical references. Students, regarding symbols, colors from the red part of the spectrum, including orange and pink, recur throughout Beloved, although the meaning of these red objects varies. Amidello's red velvet, for example, is an image of hope and a brighter future, while both these red heart represents feeling and emotion. Overall, red seems to connote vitality and visceral nature of human existence. Yet in Beloved, vitality often goes hand in hand with morality, and red images simultaneously refer to life and death, presence and absence. Students, for example, the red roses that line the road to the carnival serve to herald the carnival's arrival in town and announce the beginning of Seth. Daniel and Paul breathe new life together, yet they also stink of death. The red rooster signifies manhood to Paul D, but it is a manhood that Paul D himself has been denied. Students, the story of Emmy's search for carmine velvet seems especially poignant because we sense the futility of the dream. Student Seth's memory is warm with the red of her daughter's blood and the pink mineral of her gravestone, both of which have been bought at a dear price. Students' trees are another symbol. In the world of Beloved, trees serve primarily as sources of healing, comfort, and life. Daniel's wrought closest of boxwood bushes functions as a place of solitude and its spawns for her. Students, the beautiful trees of Sweet Home mask the true horror of plantation in Seth's memory. Paul finds his freedom by following flowering trees to the north, and Seth finds hers by escaping through a forest, by imagining the scars on Seth's chocolate cherry tree. Spaldy describes his heart as a tin tobacco box after his traumatizing experience at Sweet Home, and especially at the prison camp in Alfred, Georgia. He locks away his feelings and memories in this box, which has, by the time Poldy arrives at 1 to 4, rusted over completely. By alienating himself from his emotions, Poldy hopes to preserve himself from further psychological damage. In order to secure his protection, Poldy sacrifices much of his humanity by foregoing feeling and gives up much of his selfhood by repressing his memories. Okay, students, see you in next lecture, students.